Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Spare a Thought, the podcast that shines a light on the people, ideas, issues, and organisations that are often overlooked or misrepresented in the media. I'm your host, Tom Spare. This is episode 7 of season 4. I'm in a secret location where I'll shortly be meeting environmentalist and author Rob Hopkins, who, along with others, including musician Mr. Kit, have created a time machine. They've been to the future, and Rob is here to tell us that we won. We turned the tide on climate change. Rob is going to be telling us today how that happened, and we're going to get a glimpse into the future. We're setting the time machine for 2030. Rob has taken a refreshing look on how we can approach climate change. He's been an environmentalist and activist all of his life, and he spent decades trying to change people's perspectives and try and find inventive ways of us to think differently about the environment. Rob has written a book called How to Fall in Love with the Future. He's gone to 2013 and he's brought back the lessons of how we can make sure that we make the best of what is a very dire situation with our environment. So let's head to the time machine and meet Rob. The time machine looks different to anyone that looks at it from the outside. Let's have a look inside.
Okay, so I'll just pop the door open here, and yeah, if you just hop up there, Tom, up the ladder there. There we go. I'll just pop up as well and shut the door, and then yeah. So if you take the seat here, and I'll sit here, and you can see the controls. They're really, really simple. It's basically like an electric car. You have backwards, forwards, and go, and you can just and you set the date and the location you want to go to. So I'm just going to set this here for 2030. Boom, there we go, and set the location. There we go. Okay, so if you just put your seatbelt on, because sometimes it can get a little bit choppy around 2026, 2027. We might experience a little bit of turbulence around then. But when we arrive, I'll pop the hatch open and we'll get out and have a walk about.
Great, let's go.
I'm Rob Hopkins. I'm one of the co-founders of the transition movement. I am an artist and a parent and a public speaker, and I write books. And the most recent of those is called How to Fall in Love with the Future. And I also recently have been doing a music project with an artist called Mr. Kit, which is called Field Recordings from the Future.
Amazing. Thank you very much. And thank you for being on Spare a Thought.
Thank you for inviting me along. How gorgeous.
So before we talk about time travel and to looking to what is to come so we can fall in love with the future, I'd like to look back into your past. How did you get involved in environmentalism and activism? And has it got to do with anything related to a Tibetan Buddhist monastery in Tuscany?
Well, I guess before that, when I was about 13, punk was a huge influence for me. The kind of politics that went along with that, and that kind of do-it-yourself culture, and that spirit of here are 3 chords, now form a band, which I just loved. And so that introduced me to feminist politics and anarchist politics and anti-nuclear ideas. It was one of the reasons that I turned vegetarian when I was 14, and I'm 57, and I've been vegetarian ever since. So it was a big impact on me. And then, well, as you say, when I was 18, 19, something like that, I went to live in Tuscany in this incredible Buddhist monastery called Istituto Lama Tsongkhapa, really initially just because I wanted to find a way to stay out of England because I was so fed up with the place, and I wanted to find I wasn't really interested in Buddhism or anything. I was quite interested and curious about learning how to meditate. But beyond that, I wasn't really interested. And I rocked up as this rather bewildered, lost kind of 19-year-old kid from Bristol, and they trying to find a way that I could stay out of England. And they said, well, if you stay here then and you work 5 days a week, then that covers your staying here. So I was like, oh, brilliant. So I have a way. And they said, this guy, he's the house manager. He runs the place. It was a big place. Like, it was a hotel. It was like a 140-bed hotel, you know. And they said, you're working with this guy. He's Alessandro. He'll show you the ropes. So he taught me how to do all the laundry and sweep and mop a long corridor and clean the bathrooms and all that. And after 3 weeks, he said, I'm off now. I'm going to Elba to work there for the summer. I was like, oh, who takes over after you? You do. Here are the keys. And there's 100 people coming in on Thursday. And it was the best thing ever happened to me. You know, it was like just all of a sudden people depended on me, and I needed to be responsible. And at the same time, I was around all these extraordinary Buddhist teachers who were passing through, many of whom are no longer with us, but who were that generation of Tibetan lamas who, in 1959, when the Chinese invaded, basically just upped and walked over the mountains into India and carried that whole tradition in their heads while the Chinese government were blowing it to bits with cannons and burning all those texts on bonfires. They carried it all in their memory, basically, over the mountains. And so I had the incredible privilege of studying with some of those people. Yeah. So I guess for me, and then from there, then I went on to India, and I went traveling about in India, and in Pakistan, I was traveling with this Australian guy, and he introduced me to the concept of permaculture. We went to the Hunza Valley, which is still the most beautiful place I ever went in my entire life. A completely resilient, self-sustaining agricultural system, irrigated by glaciers from the mountains, and just the most beautiful all terraces running down the mountainside. And then he kept talking about permaculture. And then when I got back to the UK, someone gave me a copy of Bill Mollison's Permaculture Designer's Manual, and that was it. I was hooked.
And that experience, as you say, so being so young, having responsibility thrown upon you, and having those responsibilities shaping you. Can you explain what permaculture is?
Yeah, sure. Permaculture is something that's always notoriously difficult to explain in the pub. You know, like the easiest way to explain it is to get a flip chart and a pen and to draw lots of different elements of a garden system, like a orchard and a compost heap and a pond and a house, and then to draw all the connections between them. And how you would design, how basically cheap fossil fuels have meant that we've lost the art of designing in the way that nature does. So if you look at how nature does things, there are certain principles that apply to how natural systems function, how natural systems work, that we've kind of given up on because we don't need to, because we have so much energy, that means we don't need to. So permaculture is really like applied common sense. It's like it's a design system. I think it's like a design glue that you use to assemble different elements of whatever it is you want to build, whether it's a business or a farm or a garden or a house, whatever it is. You can take those principles from how natural systems work. You can apply them to that. It's also something that has a very strong kind of again, like, it was why it appealed to me so much. It has a quite a similar sense to punk, in that sense that it's like, it's not that hard. You know, there was a very famous, I think, Scritti Politti in 1978 made a 7-inch single where it had like a wraparound sleeve that was basically everything that you needed to know in order to make a record like that. How much the mastering cost, how much the labels cost, where they got them printed, everything you needed to know in order to make your own. And permaculture is kind of like that. It's very hopeful, solutions focused, optimistic. It has that spirit of, if you see something need doing, do it. Get on with it, make it happen. And yeah, for me, it was like when I did my permaculture course, it's like it kind of rewires your brain so that you see the world in possibilities. You see what could be rather than what is. And that's a very, very powerful thing.
It must be incredibly liberating, I suppose, as well, to sort of think.
Yeah. I mean, I was kind of lucky, I feel, because I came across it just before I then went. And so I went to university when I was 24. so I left school, I lived in Italy, I traveled around, I did different things, I did different jobs. I was 24 when I decided to go to university because I found a course that I wanted to do, which was one of the first sustainability courses at the time. And I'm so glad I did my permaculture training first, because otherwise I would have it would have been horrifically heartbreaking, the whole thing. They'd be presenting all these things, there's this problem, there's that problem. I'd be going, actually, you can do this, you can do that, that actually permaculture had gave me this whole sort of suite of solutions and approaches that weren't in the academia at that time. They were just like, well, wastewater goes into the sea. And I was like, well, what about reed beds? What about natural filtration? What about all these things? And actually they're doing that here, and in fact, I went to see that last weekend with my permaculture group, so I'm very, very grateful that it gave me that sort of toolkit of stories before I then went into that world.
And I think, sometimes it's about when people are getting a bit stuck in their life, it often can be because they've sort of done things perhaps in a little bit of the wrong order. So it sounds like you assembled your life and the foundation in quite a sort of unconventional way, but then it ended up preparing you very well for the rest of your career.
So in 2010, I finished doing a PhD at the university in Plymouth, and the following year they got in touch and asked if I would come in and give a talk to students about my career path. I was like, what career path? Like, there are people who have a career path because they sit down and they sort of intentionally plan it and figuring it out. And it's like, that thing that you do when you apply for jobs sometimes, when you have to basically take this wildly eclectic load of stuff that you've done and sort of script it and present it as if like, well, this was all entirely conscious and planned, entirely leading up to this job opportunity here. And, and it's a bit like, I've basically I think I'm sort of an endlessly curious person. So I'm always like following the things that what if we did that? What would happen if we did that? And, I've been very lucky. Emma, my wife, who we've been together for 35 years this year, has gone on that journey with me, and it's been very much, we moved to Ireland and I started teaching permaculture, and we set up an eco village project, and we built the first new cob house that was built in Ireland for more than 100 years, and planted trees and grew food and all that stuff, and it's like none of that would be like if you sat down with your careers advisor, they would say. But then when we moved back to England, and we didn't come back intending to start what became the transition movement, but actually then you look at all these different things we did, and somehow they all kind of took us to this place. So I always say to people, follow your curiosity. Don't follow what someone else has set out for you. Follow what makes you come alive and makes you really curious, and do that. And you don't know where it'll take you, but if you don't do that, you can be sure it'll take you somewhere you don't want to go. So why not have a risk and see where you might want to go?
What role does Totnes play in your story? And you've mentioned it already, the sort of the transition network. So why is Totnes so special? What role does it play in your story?
We spent 10 years living in Ireland from 1996 till 2005. And when we decided that we were going to move back to England, for the last 5 years that we were in Ireland, I was teaching permaculture at an adult education college in Kinsale on the south coast. And in this kind of really interesting, progressive adult education college with this quite eccentric, fabulous maverick in the Irish education system, which can be quite formal and rigid, and this is how it is. There's a guy there coming to the end of his career who'd always been a bit of a maverick and a bit of a black sheep, and who was really interested in vocation, the power of kind of vocational education and training in ways that really broaden people's horizons and have a good impact on the world. And my friend Belinda already was teaching a drama course there, really extraordinary drama course, like wild drama course. And I used to get and I was at that time I was teaching a permaculture design course, which is like the normal format that permaculture is taught in. I was teaching that as an evening class in a college in Skibbereen, which is further to the west from there. And I was talking to my friend Belinda, and I said, you know what I'd love to do would be to run a year-long permaculture course. She said, oh, you should come in and have a chat with John, who was the principal in Kinsale College. So I went and had a chat with him and told him all about the idea. He hadn't heard of permaculture, but immediately he was like, yeah, this is the kind of thing. I'm into this sort of thing. And he said, well, we'd need 14 people to make it run. Do you think we could get 14 people for the first year? I said, yeah, I think we could. That first year we had 25 students. Every year after that, we had 40 students, and the course was full, and it was full before any other course took any bookings at all. It was just crazy. We went from the grounds around the college all just being lawn at the beginning of the course to by the time I left, there was no lawn left really. And we had built a straw bale house, and we had built a theatre using cob and cordwood, and we had built polytunnels and gardens and fruit trees. It was just fantastic. And so but the last year that I was there, because I had to write none of those modules for permaculture, natural building, woodland management, none of that stuff existed in the Irish education system. So we had to write all those modules from scratch. In the last year that I was there, we added a second year to the permaculture course. And that second year had a project where I asked the students to imagine that the town of Kinsale had taken an intentional decision to wean itself off its dependency on oil and gas and fossil fuels over a 20-year period in such a way that where it arrived at the end of that period was better than where it started from. And over the course of that year with the students, I just gave them loads and loads and loads of material. We went to visit really cool projects. We watched films. I told them about different things. I was giving them lots and lots of stuff. And then I put them into pairs, and then they had to each write like a timetabled thing about what that would look like. So then in like late April, this was 2005, I got all their assignments back, so 2 of them looked at education, 2 of them looked at tourism, 2 of them looked at transport, whatever it was, And I thought, this is just brilliant. When you looked at it all together and you put all these different subjects together, I thought this is just fascinating. And people who are listening, if you search online for Kinsale Energy Descent Action Plan, you can find this document still. It's out there somewhere. And so I had a little bit of budget left as the teacher. And so I pulled all these things together, and I wrote an introduction, what this was all about. And I made it into a little document, which we called the Kinsale Energy Descent Action Plan. And then we did the last thing I did before we left and moved here was a conference called Fueling the Future that was about oil and gas and the energy transition. So then when I rocked up here in Totnes, all I had really was a couple of phone numbers of people who said, oh, if you go to Totnes, you should meet up with so-and-so. And I had this Kinsale Energy Descent Action Plan. And I started running an evening class here that was based on that document, that was based on the course that I'd run in Kinsale, turned into a 10-week evening class, started meeting people, met a guy called Naresh Jangrande, who was also very interested in a lot of these issues. And we started doing presentations together and talks together. And Totnes is a place that has quite a long history of it's one of 6 or 7, I think, in the UK kind of laboratory towns, like progressive little places far enough away from London that they have their own identity, and with a population that are sort of trusting enough of eccentrics that people can try stuff out. And a lot of the time those things don't work, and that's all right. No one's any worse off. But sometimes those things take off. So Totnes had already been a place where lots of art stuff had happened. It was where the first vegetable box scheme in the country started here with Riverford. There was a whole bunch of different things that were here. And so transition kind of became like an umbrella that pulled all these disparate things together and said, here's a story that sort of that makes sense. So really what we were doing was a kind of, I think for me, to answer your question, why it's so important is that Totnes was a kind of a laboratory, like a testing ground where we could try out different ideas. And what became known as Transition Town Totnes and then grew, we just started it really as an experiment to see, would this thing work in Totnes? After 6 months, we had so many people getting in touch from all around the world saying, what are you doing? How do you do it? Can we do it too? That we had to start Transition Network as an organization based in Totnes, which supported that wider movement as it grew and evolved and took shape. So Totnes is where lots of things were tried out. Many of those things went on to be replicated in many, many other places around the world. And being part of this network now of thousands of transition groups, it was also a place that could learn from those places and bring those ideas and make them happen here.
And so it's been sort of going for 20 years?
Nearly 20 years, yeah, which makes me feel horribly old. And they actually had a 20th anniversary celebration of it this summer.
So before we jump ahead, it's important to acknowledge the current reality. What are the problems that we're facing at the moment with our climate? And how might those problems get worse if they're left unchecked?
That's a big question. That's a 3-hour podcast all on its own, I think, probably. You know, the thing with climate science is that it's complex but not complicated. You know, the very important distinction between those two things. There's an organization called Climate Science Basics who are really, really great at kind of making climate science understandable. And they have this beautiful thing where they say they have 5 points. They say, number one, it's warming. We can all see that. There is no one listening to this summer who will not have recognized this summer and previous summers, the warming trend that we're seeing around the world, like accelerating insanely. Like the Norway, Sweden, Denmark have had the most insanely hotter than they should be summers, you know, and records have been broken all around the world. That trend is established and is happening. So it's warming. Number two, it's us. This is not a natural cycle. This is not a hoax. This is not like, this is something that is caused by human beings and their love for burning things, particularly fossil fuels and forests. Number three, we're absolutely sure at this stage, there is no doubt our incredible people, and however much the current US administration might like to think, well, if we just decommission all the satellites that actually gather the data that show us the world is warming and that this being driven by climate change, then somehow it'll magically disappear. And if we stop scientists being allowed to use the word climate change, it'll magically disappear. It won't. We are sure that's what's happening. Number four, it's bad. Like this is already, we have increased the world's temperature by 1.5 degrees on pre-industrial levels. We are now at like 432 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. That we know scientifically that the safe place to have stayed was 350 parts per million. That was sometime in the late 70s, early 80s. And well, we are way, 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 way beyond that now. But number five is we can do something about it. We are not completely passive in the face of it. We know what will happen if we leave this problem unaddressed. In that at the moment, it looks like the world is on track at least for 2 degrees, probably 3 degrees, unless we see rapid, urgent action. I was in France recently at an event where someone from the Environment Ministry was proudly saying that the French Environment Minister had commissioned a report, which was actually published recently, on how France could adapt to a 4-degree increase in temperature. And I said, there is absolutely, I can save you a lot of time and a lot of money and effort. There is absolutely zero chance that France can adapt to a 4-degree world. It's insane to even think about it. And where is your report about how France could adapt and flourish and actually create stay below 2 degrees, live in a way that is consistent with staying below 2 degrees? Why are you just throwing your hands up and going, qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire? You know, what can we do? It's like, you're the bloody government here, you know, and you're just throwing your hands up and going, well, 4 degrees is now inevitable. If 4 degrees is inevitable, we are toast. And that is it, game over. We know that once you go beyond 2 degrees, the major bread baskets in the world start to fail. And you get a whole lot of sort of tipping points that then kind of kick in. And we're already seeing some of those happening now. People use the term climate emergency rather than climate change, because this is not just some like process. Things will just change a little bit. It'll get hotter here and cooler there. This is absolutely an emergency. And look at this very much in the wider context of the fight for social justice around the world, in that you can see now how there is a terrifying map people can find online, I'm sure, which shows that if the world reaches 3 degrees, which at the moment we're on track to do in about 2070, if the world hits 3 degrees, whole parts of the world become uninhabitable. And all across, like, vast swathes of Africa, parts of Asia. It's the most horrific graphic you'll ever see. It's like, and then going along with that is the fact that now European nations are basically turning in Europe and America into fortress Europe. You know, the European Union is paying these countries to keep people there. The whole thing is so avoidable and so horrific. And I've been doing this work now for 20, 30 years. You know, in 2008, we wrote a book called The Transition Handbook, which was the book that really kickstarted the movement and had all the kind of tools and ideas and things in. In that book, we said, our dependency on fossil fuels represents a key vulnerability. Our dependence on imports of food as well is a key vulnerability. Actually, what the world could have done at that point was to begin a well-designed, like we had set out in the work we did in Kinsale, an intentional plan to end our dependency on fossil fuels. And it would have been so much easier. It would have been a curve like this. We have procrastinated now. For people who are listening to this, I'm drawing the sort of 45-degree downward curve. Actually what we've done now is get to a stage where we have left it so late that to have any chance of staying under 2 degrees, it's almost like a vertical drop that needs to happen. That's never happened before. Our survival depends on us actually doing it. What we did instead of starting that process back in 2008 was, among other things, send Vladimir Putin 18 billion euros every month, and then however many years later, 14 years later, when inevitably that's used to kickstart the war in Ukraine, and during all of that time, we've been told, there's no money for decarbonizing Europe. There's no money. It's too expensive. We can't do that. It's not possible. It's too expensive. Then the European Union find 800 billion euros to rearm Europe against the threat of Europe, which has been the biggest threat during all of that time. The rolling increase of climate change or the threat from Russia. Do you know what I mean? It's like, so it's not like this is just some inevitable thing that's happened. This has happened due to politician after politician and government after government making the wrong decision every time, because the oil and gas industry is still the most powerful industry history has ever known, the most powerful force on this planet, who are bought off scientists, bought off politicians. It's an absolute travesty and a scandal. And now what's happening in the UK is that the people who are standing up and going, what are you doing? This is not acceptable, are being criminalized and thrown into prison. So for me, it's like, this is the great existential challenge of our time, right? And any solutions that are put forward at this point to the climate emergency need to be bold and audacious and ambitious. And that's just not happening. So that's me attempting to answer that question as briefly as possible. But what I would say is, if anyone is listening to this and you are not regularly terrified about climate change, you are not paying attention, and you need to really you need to get up to speed with this, figure out what's happening, the scale of the urgency of this, roll up your sleeves and get involved in it, because they say if fires, if your life depends upon it, when it comes to climate change, it absolutely does.
Yeah, well said. And I've been listening to the audio version of your book, How to Fall in Love with the Future. And I really love it when the writer reads the book as well, because you feel more of a connection to the writer. But there was something I felt, there was a mix of feelings I had. First time in a long while, I felt hopeful, but then it was mixed in with fear as well. And it's sort of like, the fear tied in with, if we mess this up, then that's it. It gets a lot worse than this. And I loved the conversation that you had with the people from the future, and telling you what it was like and what the decisions were made, that had to be made in order for that future to get better. And being very clear that it's not a perfect future, and you didn't get everything right, but made tremendous change in a short period of time, and people got together and communities came back, and people started seeing neighbors again rather than just someone that lives next door. It was less about I and a lot more about we.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, I'm really glad you enjoyed it. And it's you would imagine that sitting in a little wooden box reading a book you've written would be the dossiest day's work ever. It's the most astonishingly exhausting thing. Like the first day you finish at 5, I was asleep by 7. It's really quite a thing. Yeah, the point of the book was really, there were 2 questions I think that run through the book. Which the first one is, what does our activism look like if, rather than seeing its goal as being giving people as much information as possible in the hope that they'll change, which we've done for 20, 30, 40 years, doesn't work at scale. what does it look like instead if we saw the aim of our activism as being the cultivation of longing? The intention is to tell such intoxicating, delicious, beautiful stories about what we could still create. That's what people get up in the morning wanting to see happen. And then the other question is, what does our activism look like if we acted as though time travel was possible, which is quite out there as a question. And that was definitely a book. Having written a few books before, I was thinking, is this the book where people go, yeah, I was with him up until now, but he's lost the plot completely. Like, what is he going on about? I have no idea at all. But actually, what I hear from people is that they find that a really, really useful set of tools and kind of way of looking at it. But that kind of mixture of feeling hope and feeling, what was the thing he said? Like
fear.
Yeah. I think that's quite an intoxicating. I mean, that's kind of what fuels me, is the mix of those two things. It's like, because if you're just hopeful all the time, you're really not paying attention to what's going on. Like, what are you basing that on? At the same time, if you're just fearful all the time and depressed and despondent, and what's the point? You're kind of ineffectual. And I kind of feel as well like my pessimism, my resignation, my hopelessness is a gift that those people who are destroying everything do not get from me. They absolutely do not get that. They do not deserve that. They have paid a lot of money to bring around a situation where people are feeling like that, and they don't get that gift off me. So for me, that the point of the book is that it's a recognition. It's kind of me going, look, I'm 57, right? I turned 57 this year. I've been involved in this stuff since I was about 13, through anti-nuclear politics and this, that, and the other, and permaculture, and trying to be a force for change in the world. And we are losing this spectacularly, actually. And so the book is kind of me saying, well, I don't know what will work here. I have no idea. But maybe some of these things. Let's try some other stuff. Let's shake this up a little bit. And actually, if like Don DeLillo, the novelist, said, longing at a large scale is what makes history. I love that quote so much. Longing on a large scale is what makes history. Just standing around and talking about collapse and extinction all the time does not cultivate longing at all. It's very important, and the Extinction Rebellion was incredibly important in holding that space and going, that's where we're headed. Really? Is that what we want to do? But I'm sort of trying to just kind of experiment with, well, what happens actually if our activism is based on longing? Well, then maybe it means we need to be making music projects where we connect people to the future. Maybe we need to be bringing in smell and playing with smell and sound and taste. And maybe we need to be building time machines and tickets and machines that print out tickets that tell you what your future is, and jukeboxes where you can hear recordings from the future. I have no idea if that's going to work, Tom, but I know that actually the things we've done that have got us to here are not working at scale, and so maybe it's worth trying some other things.
In the studio, we've got your time machine.
Yeah.
What does it look like on the outside?
I think the very important thing about this time machine is that it looks to each different person. It looks different to each different person who sees it. It's kind of part of its powers are that it looks like something different to everybody, because everybody has their own different sort of cultural, imaginative sort of ideas of what that might be like. And so there is no, it's like a changeling, like it's a morphing thing. It will look, 5 people could be looking at it and they might be seeing a completely different thing every time they do that. So it's impossible to take photographs of. If you take photographs of, you can't, because it doesn't show up, because cameras don't have any imagination. But when people look at it, it looks different to each person.
And is that the same when you go inside it? Is it the same thing, or is it when you get inside? Is it?
Yeah, once you get inside, it's pretty straightforward, really. It's built on the chassis of an old bus, so it has like sort of seats in the front and some storage space in the back. The controls are quite straightforward. You've got like forward, back, and you set the date. That's about it, really. It took us quite a long time to build. You know, we have a secret laboratory underneath Totnes Castle, and when we travel, It's a small crew that travels. We have to do time traveler training before we can go. So one of the elements of that is that you have to learn that when you arrive in the future, you don't do any past splaining. So you're not allowed to arrive there and say, well, that's never going to work, because actually in that future, it is working. And you can't turn up, trot along with your 2025 cynicism and despondency in a world that is actually making extraordinary things happen, because that's just not okay. And we have to wear special suits that have a very strong anti-cynicism coating, so that we don't sort of contaminate things when we get there. But then apart from that, it's just, so there's a small crew. So I always travel with Mr. Kit, who is a colleague of mine who is the sound recorder. So he goes there to make audio recordings of that future that we can bring back, because maybe if you bring audio recordings back from the future, that's the thing that really triggers the longing in people. And we also travel with a young woman called Wasima, who has developed a sensory recorder, which can record not just sounds, but also records like the feelings and the tastes and the smells and the kind of emotions of it, which are also really, really important. And then the idea is that as when we return with those things to 2025, that's what allows us to unlock longing at scale, is the fact that we can connect people to that future and how it turned out.
The time machine looks different to anyone that looks at it from the outside. Let's have a look inside.
Okay, so I'll just pop the door open here, and if you just hop up there, Tom, up the ladder there. There we go. I'll just pop up as well and shut the door, and then so if you take the seat here, and I'll sit here, and you can see the controls. They're really, really simple. It's basically like an electric car. You have backwards, forwards, and go, and you can just and you set the date and the location you want to go to. So I'm just going to set this here for 2030. And boom, there we go, and set the location. There we go. Okay, so if you just put your seatbelt on, because sometimes it can get a little bit choppy around 2026, 2027. We might experience a little bit of turbulence around then. But when we arrive, I'll pop the hatch open, and we'll get out and have a walk about.
Great, let's go. What does the future smell like?
I think the first impression when you arrived there, if you had the nose of a sommelier, you would be smelling all sorts of things in the air when you arrived there. The first thing you notice is that it's just much, much fresher and cleaner. You know, we realized in 2025 the terrible damage that air pollution was causing. You know, tens of thousands of people were dying every year from air pollution around the world, but it was also having an impact, particularly on poorer black and brown communities, working class communities who were close to areas of high pollution. You know, the right to smell clean air is not equally distributed throughout society, and so we decided very much that needed to be addressed. And so I think now when you walk around in cities, you have a mixture of the cities are much softer, because we've removed at that stage about 40% of hard surfaces from cities that began with the depaving movement that started around 2024 and grew very, very quickly. So cities, they sort of smell much softer, much more kind of absorbent, like there's more moisture, because there's more soil and more things that hold the moisture there. There's more plants, there's more flowers. You can smell a wide variety of those as you walk around. There's a lot more herbs and productive plants, fruit trees, different things like that you can smell as you walk around. You smell much more food being cooked, bread being baked, food is much more part of communities, actually have kind of restructured around food in many, many ways. Back in 2025, 1 in 4 young mothers in the UK were going hungry on a regular basis because they couldn't afford to feed their kids. And the level of food poverty in the country that people depend on food banks was absolutely scandalous. And so in 2026, there was a big push around the right to food, that everybody had a right to food. And in the same way that after the Second World War, the government, in order to address food poverty, opened what were called British restaurants, which were like socially government-funded restaurants where everybody could have access to good, nutritious meals at a very low cost. These spread across the country and tied in with local food, free school meals, all of that sort of stuff. So I think they smell like growing things. They smell much more like a forest than like a city. And and I think just the last thing to say is they don't smell the same everywhere. So as you walk around, it's a bit like when you go to Venice, and every step you take, you look and you see something else that's really, really fascinating and interesting and makes you really curious. It's like that with smells. Our cities are now a kind of a very granular tapestry of interesting smells that make us feel so much more alive and curious, I think.
Yeah, very nourishing. Sounds like the
yeah.
And what does the future sound like?
It sounds like, because the sound of the internal combustion engine is gone, or is much, much, much less, and because there are many more now car-free neighborhoods and areas where cars have been designed out, what that means is that when you walk around, you can hear to a level of detail that you couldn't really hear before. So, for example, when you walk down some streets, you can hear things like people having piano lessons in their houses. I don't remember that from 2025. It was always drowned out by something else. In the same way, you can hear like the sound of knives and forks on plates in people's houses, that sort of thing. You hear a lot more sound of children playing in the streets. You hear a lot more conversation and laughter and birdsong. The birdsong is now far louder than the traffic. And in fact, there are parts of the city, because after the ban on pesticides in 2026, and we saw the bounding back of nature and natural systems, and then the bird populations with it as well. It means now there are certain parts, like in a city like London, for example, there are now parts of London, that old song the Nightingale sang in Berkeley Square. You can actually now go and hear the Nightingale singing in Berkeley Square again. And it's become a thing which actually there are musicians who go along during the months when the Nightingale sings and sit in Berkeley Square and accompany the music that the Nightingale sings. And for many people on a night out in London, it becomes the way to end the night, is to go and listen to that. You hear owls back in the city. It's much more if you remember during COVID, when it was suddenly changed so much, and it was so much quieter, and it was the most beautiful spring of our lives, and there were no planes, and the world sounded different. I went out with my recorder and made recordings of just what it sounded like during that time. It kind of sounds like that again, but like all the time. Yeah, but I think it's the sound of children playing and the bird song that are the things that stay with me the most, actually.
What can you see? What does the future look like?
It looks in many ways like the present. This isn't like some sort of Star Wars, Buck Rogers, Star Trek sort of Dune thing where we've somehow magically in 5-10 years' time rebuilt the whole world in kind of passive houses and solar panels. Really, when you walk around, it looks pretty much the same, although some very, very key things have shifted. So the houses that you're passing are now much, much, much better insulated. Every house is a power station. Every house generates more energy than it actually uses. Nobody is living in horrible flats with black mold and no heating. The right for people to live good lives has been recognized. The society has become much more equal. And so when that happens, there's an improvement in mental health kind of across the board. It looks much greener. We recognized in 2025, after that very, very hot summer of 2025, which you probably remember, that when Arthur's Seat in Edinburgh caught fire, and that because it was how hot it was getting, we recognized that in urban areas, concrete and tarmac is really dangerous stuff. Like you get above 29, 30 degrees, concrete and tarmac is very dangerous, public health issue. So this depaving movement, which I mentioned before, which wasn't driven by kind of government diktats, it was driven by communities competing against each other to remove more concrete and tarmac, supported by local councils, supported by government. But it was communities who rallied around this idea of liberating soil. And so cities look much softer, much greener. You don't see so many cars, I said before, so you see a lot more trams, a lot more public transport. But I think the most important thing that you see is the look in people's eyes as they walk past you. You remember back in 2025, there was this look often of kind of despondency, people avoiding each other's gaze, people as sort of atomized individuals. I think in this world, there's a sense of, I think we might just do this. I mean, that's why you said at the beginning, it's not a perfect world. And back in 2025, people so easily would say, well, it's either utopia or it's a dystopia. The point with what we're talking about here is it's neither. Utopias are profoundly unhelpful. They're so far away that they're just like, they give us some vague idea of a general direction to move in. Dystopias, we were awash with dystopias in 2025. You open Netflix and it's like, which do you want to choose from? Are we wiped out by zombies, by aliens, by whatever, by gremlins, and it was viruses. What we realized we needed were through-topias, were the stories that started now of how we got from here to there. So when you walk around and look at it, it looks like the world that we left behind, but it has these key things and this look in people's eyes of, I think we're going to do this, which was the most amazing thing, because by then people could see the impacts that were unfolding around them. They could see young people's mental health improving. They could see their energy bills were going down. They could see that the insects were starting to come back again, and that we were just on the beginning of that journey. So there's a sense of anticipation, of excitement, of pride that we were the people who saw this coming and we headed it off, and it was kind of the making of us.
What are the challenges that we're looking at, that we're seeing?
Well, I think it's still many of the challenges that we have now. There are still some people who are saying, "Oh, we should go back. We should go back to how it was before because that feels safer. I feel out of my comfort zone. This doesn't feel. I don't recognize this, and I don't understand it. And can we not just go back?" There were still some of those voices, but they were much, much less now than they were before, because the majority of people can see that the world is becoming a much, much better place. But still people still fall out. People still get sick. It's not like all that stuff has magically vanished, but we've changed direction. We've stopped going from using more and more fossil fuels, creating more and more CO2 every year, eradicating more and more species every year, and we're halfway down the other side of that curve. That's the thing that's changed. But people are still people, and the world is still the world. And also, it's not like climate change has just somehow magically disappeared. So we still are living with the impacts of climate change, but we are on we're on the best case scenario profiles of that. We're on course to get to zero carbon by 2050, but at the same time, we're building out all the natural things we know allow us to draw down carbon out of the atmosphere, because the way that we were told it could work with carbon capture and storage, which was basically a nonsense kind of Mickey Mouse technology that the fossil fuel industry has invented in order to justify their continued existence, which actually didn't work, didn't actually draw down any CO2, took billions of pounds of government money to try and keep fossil fuels companies quiet and behaving themselves. It didn't work. So instead, we're building out kelp forests at speed in the oceans. We're reforesting. We're adding carbon to our soils. All of that sort of stuff is all happening really, really at pace as well. Yeah, so it's not perfect. It's not perfect, but it's pretty wild. And it's pretty amazing to be there.
What changes had to take place in order to achieve that world?
It had to become a much fairer world, a much more equitable world. It became clear that billionaires invested trillions of dollars in building AI systems, and one of their big carrots they dangled in front of the world was that actually the AI systems would give us the solutions to the climate emergency. So what happened was somewhere near the end of 2025, they built AIs that they could do that to, and the billionaires asked the AI what the solution was to climate change, and AI said to get rid of the billionaires, which wasn't what they'd invested in it for, but that was the answer, because that was the answer. You can't have that level of inequality and wealth, and that much wealth that we need to harness in order to tackle this, locked up in the hands of psychopaths who don't care about the rest of humanity. So that was one of the things. I think there was a real recognition that we had, that the kind of the far right political movements that were growing at that time, back in 2025, who had a narrative that said the future's terrifying, the future's really scary, we're strong and we'll protect you from that they were actually movements of profound lack of imagination. And the only answers they had were, we want to go back to how things were before. The speed of urgency and innovation just swept that stuff aside. You know, you couldn't cling on to that. That was just not a viable position anymore. And there was a real recognition that we all pulled through this or none of us pulled through this. So there was a coming together of incredibly diverse movements around new stories and new narratives for change. We recognized that narrative in 2025 that said, oh, we just have to move slowly in little incremental steps, and there's no money to do this stuff, was rubbish. And it had always been rubbish. And that was kind of swept aside by very strong, very powerful movements. And I think just the last thing to say is, I think there was also, you know, you'll remember, Tom, really well, back in 2025, the horrific genocide that was happening in Gaza at that time, and what was happening in Ukraine and other parts of the world. There was a recognition, I think, finally, that the ability to wage peace and to make peace happen was far more important and noble and needed than the ability. Anyone can start a war and wage a war, but there were very few people. So people like Scylla Elworthy and people who were like those kind of early pioneers of the art of diplomatically waging peace, that spread very, very quickly. And there was a recognition that that in order to bring that world about, we had to learn how to live alongside people that we don't agree with, because the alternative that was being pushed back in 2025 of Fortress Europe, pushing back boats, putting up fences and borders, criminalizing the incredibly violent immigration system that was put in place, it was morally completely untenable and indefensible. And that Western nations that had become so rich from any country that exports weapons to other countries has absolutely no right to put up borders to keep other people out. So it became that world that we go to is a world where this sense that we have a moral obligation to offer a warm welcome to people who have to move became really, really woven, I think, into our shared values and our shared ethics.
And just finally, having been to the future, how do we maintain that sense of hope and continue to work towards it when we're faced with so much adversity and so much skepticism?
I think, like I said before, if we're all just giddily hopeful all the time, that's not actually that helpful. So for me, there was a film that was made in 2040. It was called 2040. It was made a few years ago. It was called 2040. An Australian guy who made this film about the future, and the future 2040 that he would like his daughter to grow up in. It was very interesting. Like, it used CGI to kind of try and give a sense of what that world would look like. Bits of it were amazing. Bits of it were a bit problematic, I think. But the guy Damon who made that film, he described it as an experiment in evidence-based dreaming. And I really, really love that term, evidence-based dreaming. Like, you know, if Tom decides I want to become a millionaire in 4 years' time, then generally you would think, okay, so I need to do something towards that. I need to at least start buying a lottery ticket. If you just imagine a dragon is going to magically fly by and drop gold coins on your garden, that's not that helpful. It's not really going to move things along very much. Yeah. So for me, it's like when we set ourselves the task of trying to imagine what that future would be like, and the poet Rilke said, the future must enter into you a long time before it happens. And, bell hooks said, what we cannot imagine cannot come into being. We have to make the space in our lives to try and imagine. We're living in a time where the future is being colonized and the future is being cancelled by some deeply, deeply unpleasant people. So for us to, as individuals, as organizations, as movements, to maintain that connection to the future, to the possibility that it turns out the way we want it to, not the way that Elon Musk wants it to, not the way that Peter Thiel wants it to, not the way that Vladimir Putin wants it to, or the chief exec of BP wanted to, that it could turn out the way that we want it to. We need to keep that option there, and we need to feed that option, because like William Gibson said, the future's already here. It's just not evenly distributed. The point is, when I talk about the future, that future that we went to visit earlier, that's not some strange fantasy in Rob Hopkins' imagination that I've just cobbled together as some weird delusional sort of naive fantasist. All of those things you can go and see somewhere. You could get. I met a guy a month ago who had somehow got hold of a copy of an early copy of How to Fall in Love with the Future, and had designed his summer holiday around going to visit all the places that are the stories that I tell in that. And he said, "Oh, Rob, I went to Utrecht to see the bicycle rush hour, and then I went to the Vauban in Germany to go and see the car-free neighborhoods, and then I went to the Solar restaurant in Marseille for lunch, where they cook just using the heat from the sun, concentrated in a parabolic dish into the back of the cookers, and then I went to see this, and then I went to see that." And it's like, that's, we need to, when we're trying to imagine the future, we can only be as imaginative as we have in our memory stories of those things that are possible. So for me, the first thing we need to do is to seek those stories. And what I try to do in the book is to say, we need to stop describing things as impossible. We need to lose the word impossible from our vocabulary and replace that with not yet. Because all of these things already exist somewhere. Car-free cities, car-free neighborhoods, cities building food belts around themselves, incredible renewable energy at scale. All this stuff already exists. So learn those stories, recognize that this future that Tom and I have just taken you to did not come about by accident. It happened because you rolled up your sleeves with other people, decided not to be a bystander, decided that you had to play an active role in making this happen, and that together we built one of the most incredible movements ever in history, which was a positive futurist movement that was about stories and possibility and making things actually happen on the ground. And with that came the recognition that if you want to make a movement based on longing, climate activists are rubbish at that. Climate scientists are even worse. So it was a movement that brought in artists, painters, storytellers, writers, people who worked in advertising who just decided they couldn't do it anymore, but that they had the skills and abilities that we needed in order to cultivate longing at scale. So for me, that's what we started doing differently that got us to that future. Was firstly that we recognized that we were not bystanders and that it needed us. And secondly, that we recognized that in order to cultivate longing at scale, we needed people with a wide range of skills. And when we started doing that stuff together, we came up with all kinds of amazing things that back in 2025, we couldn't even have imagined.
That concludes Spare a Thought, Episode 7, Season 4, How to Fall in Love with the Future, with Rob Hopkins. My thanks to Rob for helping us see there is an alternative future. It's within our grasp. This brings to an end the Educating for the Future series. We started with STEM and we've ended with time travel. We've come a long way. The next episode will feature a collaboration between Spur of Thought and Be the Change Media's Forgotten Generation. Tune in next Tuesday to hear that. In the show notes, you'll find links to Rob's website, newsletter, and his book, How to Fall in Love with the Future. If you want to get more content from me, you can find exclusive insights, behind-the-scenes stories, and extended reflections by subscribing to my Substack, which is also linked in the show notes. The soundtrack that's popped up a few times through This episode is all rights reserved to Rob Hopkins. There's also a combination of sound effects taken from Freesound and Wondershare Filmora. All rights reserved. Spur of Thought is a Be the Change Media Network production. Thanks for listening.